Good morning, America. Breaking overnight, Cuba's Fidel Castro, who ruled the country for nearly half a century, dead at age 90. His brother, the current leader, making the announcement.
Revolución Cubana, Fidel Castro.
With the news spreading, the reaction from Cuba now in national mourning to Florida's Little Havana overnight. The raucous scenes, celebrations in the streets. And the hopes for friends and relatives still in the country.
And I hope and I pray that the Cuban people will see freedom tomorrow.
This morning, we look at Castro's time in power.
I am not afraid to say I am a communist.
Facing off against 10 presidents, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war.
Yes, we were very close to the nuclear war, extremely close.
And the look ahead, what it could mean for the country and its people. To U.S. businesses and tourism, team coverage on this breaking story right now.
From ABC News, live in New York, this is Good Morning America.
Good morning, and we're dedicating much of this show to the breaking news, the death of Fidel Castro.
We want you to look at the contrasting scenes overnight. Right there on the streets of Miami, you can see jubilation, members of the Cuban community, many of them exiles who fled Castro's repressive regime, celebrating in the streets. Meantime, in Havana, the Cuban capital, the streets quiet and empty.
Fidel Castro was a towering figure in both a physical and a historical sense, and a controversial one in pretty much every sense. He tried to create romance around his revolution with his signature look and his sweeping, often anti-American oratory, but he was also a tyrant whose people have fled by the thousands on rickety and overloaded boats.
Castro also a persistent thorn in the side of the United States, a man who helped bring the world to the precipice of nuclear confrontation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His death comes at a very delicate moment. President Obama has recently moved to normalize relations with Cuba. However, incoming President Donald Trump has threatened to overturn those actions.
We have team coverage this morning with our reporters and analysts standing by, but we start here with ABC's Jim Avila in L.A. Jim, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan. The cigar-chomping, bearded firebrand who once gave a 7-hour speech is silenced this morning. Fidel Castro survived multiple assassination attempts by the U.S. government, but went quietly overnight after nearly a decade of failing health.
Querido pueblo de Cuba.
Fidel's brother, President Raul Castro, announcing the death of his older brother on state television, ending the broadcast echoing that infamous revolutionary slogan.
Hasta la victoria, siempre.
Castro remained skeptical and suspicious of the U.S. right up to his death, defiantly commenting after President Obama's historic visit that Cuba will never forget the Bay of Pigs invasion and does not need America.
I am a communist, a Marxist, socialist communist. I am not afraid to say I am a communist.
Fidel Castro was born in 1926 out of wedlock to a wealthy Cuban landowner and his maid. He went to Catholic schools and then studied law. His two passions were baseball. He was very good at it, and politics. He became an activist for the poor and working class. In 1956, after being expelled by Cuba's American-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista, Castro returned secretly with his brother Raul to wage a guerrilla war, seizing power in 1959.
The road to Havana paved with glory for rebel chieftain Fidel Castro.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy, just elected, approved the CIA-trained invasion force of 1,300 Cuban exiles who went ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Castro demolished them, a huge propaganda victory. In 1962, American spy planes discovered Castro had let the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Yes, we were very close to the nuclear war, extremely close.
Ultimately, the Soviets removed the missiles. Even Castro's critics praised his advances in healthcare and in education. But the inefficiency of Cuba's Soviet-style economy produced dissent. In 1980, more than 125,000 Cubans, some expelled, many allowed to just leave, braved rough seas and dehydration to come to the United States in the Mariel boat lift. In the early 1990s, the fall of the USSR cost Cuba billions of dollars in Soviet aid and trade, leading to widespread shortages and rationing. In 2006, just before intestinal surgery, he gave up power temporarily to his younger brother Raul. He never took the reins again, made it official in 2008. Then suddenly, in the summer of 2010, he began displaying his indomitable drive again in public, giving TV interviews, laying flowers at the tomb of the fallen, exhorting the communist youth, and addressing the Cuban parliament. After nearly 5 decades in power, filled with revolution, defiance, and strife, Castro did live to see the Cuban flag raised at the U.S. Embassy in 2015, and an influx of American tourists, sports teams, and rock concerts. The memorial will be what you might expect for a man who changed Cuban history and dominated the island for more than 50 years. He'll be cremated today, so the body will not be lying in state. Instead, Castro will be memorialized by millions, first in Havana, where the crowds will be asked to sign a loyalty to the revolution oath. And then his ashes will tour the island before burial in his hometown of Santiago de Cuba.
And that'll be a week from tomorrow. Jim, thank you for your reporting. And Cuba has been a consistent source of national security concerns for the U.S., from the missile crisis to Elian Gonzalez to questions about our prison in Guantanamo Bay.
For more on all of that and the potential impact of Castro's death on American policy going forward, let's go to Washington now and ABC's chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz. Martha, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan and Paula. For a generation of Americans, the threat from Cuba was real and frightening. A tiny country just off our shores, 90 miles, with a powerful ally. From military disasters to near nuclear war, the 50-year feud with the Fidel Castro-led Cuba was marked by tension and tragedy. The country's alignment with the Soviet Union led to the icy international relations with the U.S. during the Cold War, and the two nations' newfound resentment escalated quickly.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
While his allies agreed to remove their missiles, Castro's animosity towards the U.S. survived. In 1999, the custody battle over Elian Gonzalez playing out as Castro demanded the little boy's return to Cuba. His mother had drowned while escaping with him to the U.S. Armed U.S. agents forcibly removing the boy from his Miami relatives, returning him to his father in Cuba. And there is Guantanamo Bay, the naval base leased by the U.S. from the Castro regime since 1959. After the controversial practice of housing terror suspects, Castro repeatedly denounced the U.S. occupation, saying the land was being used to do America's dirty work. 10 American presidents tried to isolate Castro and hoped for his demise. Then in 2013, this defining moment, President Obama shaking hands with President Raul Castro at Nelson Mandela's funeral, paving the way for renewed diplomatic relations.
This is not merely symbolic. With this change, we will be able to substantially increase our contacts with the Cuban people.
In 2015, the two presidents meeting again as Obama calls for the 53-year-old embargo to finally be lifted. And as for Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, the lease of those 45 square acres does not seem in any danger. It can only be dissolved by mutual agreement. Dan and Paula.
Martha, stand by if you will. We want to ask you a few questions. As you reported, President Obama recently restored diplomatic relations with Cuba, but his successor, President-elect Donald Trump, has promised to reverse that policy.
Yeah, here's what Trump said at a rally in Miami in September.
We will cancel Obama's one-sided Cuban deal made by executive order if we do not get the deal we want and the deal that people living in Cuba and here deserve, including protecting religious and political freedom.
All right, for more on this, we want to bring back in Martha and ABC's chief White House correspondent, John Karl, in our Washington bureau. And first and foremost, John, what impact do you think that Castro's death is going to have on this fluid situation?
Well, he was such a symbol of the Cuban Revolution and such a symbol of tension between Cuba and the United States that even though he has effectively been out of power for 10 years, it could well have some impact on how Congress looks at this. The big change that President Obama wants to U.S.-Cuba policy is to lift the embargo, the trade embargo on Cuba. That can only be done fully by Congress. ultimately, with Castro gone, with Fidel Castro gone, there may be some lessening of the opposition there. But by and large, keep in mind, Fidel Castro has not been in power for a long time.
Yeah, so, Martha, what are you hearing, and what's your sense of where things go from here, given that we've got a new president coming in and a Congress that will be thoroughly controlled by the Republicans, a Congress with whom he can work?
Well, I think, first of all, you'll probably see Donald Trump say he really wants to study this, to see what's going to happen, to see how he'll make any changes in what President Obama has done. But this is an opportunity, in a way, for President-elect Trump to take a second look at what's going on there. I mean, Fidel Castro was such an iconic figure. He really defined what Cuba is. As John pointed out, he has been out of power for quite a long time, and his brother has said he will give up power in 2018 when his term ends. And that's what President-elect Trump will really want to look towards. Who's next? What comes after 2018? Who are the younger people who might take over, and possibly a more progressive movement?
But Martha and John, I mean, is there a sense, and I'll start with you, Martha, is there a sense that Raul is quite different from his brother and might be able now to have more latitude in his relations with the United States now that his older brother is gone?
My sense is that Raul Castro wouldn't be anywhere without Fidel Castro. So I think there is not a great deal of change with him. And I think certainly Fidel Castro, even though he was out of power, had a lot of influence on his brother.
You know, and I would say, Dan, on the actual policy coming from the United States, Donald Trump did promise, as you played the sound, did promise to undo what President Obama had done on Cuba. But at various points during the campaign, he said that he favored lifting the embargo. He favored continued diplomatic relations. So Trump has been kind of all over the map on this, at least during the course of the campaign. And he is correct that much of what President Obama has done can be undone right away with another executive order undoing President Obama's executive orders. But I don't get the sense that undoing all of that would be a top priority for President Trump. I agree with Martha that this is a perfect opportunity for him to say we are going to look at the situation, we're going to see how things have changed, and go from there.
Ever the negotiator, keeping his options open.
And Trump specifically asking for the freeing of those political prisoners. We're going to get more into the human rights crisis there in Cuba. But Martha and John, we want to thank you so much for your insight as usual. And when the news broke of Castro's death overnight, Miami's Little Havana erupted in celebration.
The streets filling with people cheering the news. And Glenna Milberg from our ABC station WPLG joins us from Miami right now. Glenna, good morning to you.
Dan, Paula, good morning from what we call Little Havana, and where I'm standing on Southwest 8th Street. This is sort of been the de facto area where people through the decades have come to protest and rally all things Cuba. Today, this morning, for the past 5 or 6 hours, it has been the scene of a huge celebration. And so many people around the country are going to look and say, well, isn't that so disrespectful, celebrating a human being dying? And I'm here to sort of be the voice of this community to say what the celebration is about today is possibly the beginning of freedom for Cuba. And that freedom is such a central theme. It's a very diverse community, but very unified in coming from a place where they were not free to vote for an elected leader. Many of the people who were in the older generation who had come here in the 60s had family members murdered, politically persecuted, had families who were separated for decades. Many of the later arrivals, some came in the 80s on the Mariel boat lift. Some people chose to come in little makeshift rafts. That's how desperate their lives in Cuba were, getting in these rafts and crossing the Straits of Florida. So many thought that this day would never come in their lifetimes because, as we've heard, Fidel Castro had grown to be such a mythic figure, such an icon of the revolution. But this community now has a period at the end of their sentence and ready to move on to another chapter in what has been a really difficult life for so many people who have actually helped Miami become what it is today. Dan, Paula?
So much hope there in Little Havana. Glenna Milberg from WPLG, thank you very much for your reporting this morning. We appreciate it. In 1977, ABC's Barbara Walters traveled to Cuba for a five-hour interview with Fidel Castro.
It was fascinating. And years later, in 1993, ABC's Diane Sawyer interviewed him for Primetime Live. Here are some excerpts of their fascinating talks.
Your newspapers, radio, television, motion pictures are under state control. No dissent or opposition is allowed in the public media.
Bárbara.
Yes.
Barbara. Nosotros no tenemos las mismas concepciones.
We do not have your same conceptions.
Nosotros no tenemos el concepto de libertad de
Our
prensa
concept of freedom of the press is not yours.
Desde luego, se lo digo con toda
And I say this very
no
honestly.
tengo que ocultar absolutamente
I have nothing to hide.
Si nos pregunta que aquí puede aparecer un periódico
If you
contra el
ask us
socialismo,
if a paper could appear here against socialism, I could
que no
say
puede
honestly,
aparecer.
no, it cannot
no lo
appear.
permitirá ni el partido,
It would not be allowed by
ni
the
el
party,
gobierno,
the government,
ni el
nor
pueblo.
the people.
En ese sentido,
Okay.
no poseemos
In that sense,
la libertad
we do
de
not
prensa
have
que posee
the
usted.
freedom of the press that you possess in the U.S.
Do you think politically that an American president can lift the embargo and resume relations with Cuba as long as Fidel Castro is in power?
If I were the obstacles, I would be willing to give up not only my positions and my responsibilities, but even my life. What I would never do is to negotiate the revolution. The revolution is not negotiable. Socialism is not negotiable. Sovereignty and the independence of our country are not negotiable. That I would never negotiate.
Does it seem crazy to you that American presidents every 4 years allow the American people just to vote them out of power, that they put their entire power at risk every 4 years?
4 años es poco para cualquier
I
programa.
think 4 years is too short for any serious program that you want to undertake.
En 8 años se puede hacer un
In 8 years, you can do a bit
programa de
more
gobierno.
in terms of a
En 12
government
o en
program.
20 se puede hacer
In
más.
12 or in 20 years, you can do much more.
And then Tom Llamas. Tom, your parents fled Cuba. I want to start with you. And, you know, we were talking this morning, this is very personal. Your parents fled, but there's also this almost danger of romanticizing the revolution and what Fidel Castro was.
Yeah, that's so true. You know, I can't remember a time when I didn't know the name Fidel Castro. I mean, I've known that name as long as since I've been alive, and it's something that has always been part of my life and my family's life. They fled Cuba, as you mentioned, as political exiles. And there is this tendency when world leaders die to kind of misplace this romanticism around some world leaders, but Fidel Castro is someone who was a tyrant. He was a killer. He was a liar. And I really never realized how fortunate I was to be born in this country until I did a story that took me to the Florida Straits, and I was embedded with the Coast Guard, and they were intercepting Cuban rafters and Cuban go-fast boats that were smuggling in Cuban citizens. And I got to see firsthand what it looked like on these boats, dozens of families, babies in diapers. And the best choice that these families had was to put their children on a boat in the middle of the night, not knowing what would happen, than to live in Cuba. And Cuba at a distance may look beautiful, it may look mysterious, it may look nostalgic, but up close, it is cracked, it is faded, and the people are hungry, and that should be the legacy of Fidel Castro.
There are no question that there are horrors, ongoing horrors in Cuba right now, and of course for decades that you just referenced. But Ron, you know, you covered, you were in our Miami bureau for years at ABC News. You've been in Cuba. There are also arguments one can make on behalf of the Castro regime.
Well, the literacy rate in Cuba is one of the highest, I believe, in the world. The infant mortality rate, I believe, is as low or maybe lower than it is in this country. But as Tom was saying, you know, I've been there in the late 90s and more recently earlier this year, and people live in fear there of even saying the name Castro out loud. They live in fear of their neighbors informing on them. They have these committees for the defense of the revolution where your neighbors can spy on one another. There have been economic gains in recent years. More people are making money. There's some free enterprise, but it's a very repressed place, and it's a very poor country. You get away from the tourist areas, it is grinding poverty there. The infrastructure is in terrible shape. It will take decades and decades for that to improve.
And on Ron's point, I mean, the literacy rate is amazing in Cuba, but you're told what to read. You can't read whatever you want, you know? They also talk about the world-class doctors in Cuba, yet the citizens receive third world health. And I can remember night after night with my family stuffing envelopes, greeting cards with medicines, Kool-Aid, just so they could have calories. And that's what I remember.
Yeah, it is incredibly powerful to hear your firsthand testimony. Tom Yamas, thank you very much. Ron Claiborne as well, thank you. Welcome back to our coverage of the death of Fidel Castro, dead overnight at the age of 90.
They're celebrating in the streets of Miami's Little Havana, but it is a much different scene in Havana, Cuba, and that is where Hannah Berkeley is this morning.
Many Cubans right now are waking up to the news that former President Fidel Castro has passed away at the age of 90. The news came in many forms late last night. Many Cuban youth were out on the streets socializing as they do any weekend night. The news came via phone calls, many family members from abroad calling, telling them the news. They could hear partying going on in Miami, but the streets of Havana looked very different. There's a much more solemn mood. Many of the elderly Cubans I spoke to who actually remember the pre-Castro days of Cuba and fought for the Cuban Revolution say that they have Fidel and the revolution to thank for everything that they have. They'll actually be able to pay homage to the former president in one of the iconic centers of the city at the Plaza of the Revolution. Then a few days later, his cremated remains will be brought to Santiago de Cuba, where they'll be buried alongside Cuba's national poet and hero, Jose Marti. Paula?
Hannah Berkeley reporting from Havana for us this morning. And joining us by phone is Florida Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and the first Cuban-American member of the House of Representatives. Good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much. This was a day we've been waiting for a long time.
I want to talk to you specifically about the human rights crisis, Ileana. People can be locked up for speaking their minds. The government still controls most of the media. According to the latest State Department report, there are 60 to 70 political prisoners. So how should that factor into U.S. relations going forward?
Oh, it should factor in very heavily. And I know that there are Fidel apologists around the world who say, oh, he's an iconic figure and he was just an old man. But this is a man who, I was born in Cuba. I had to flee with my family when I was only 8 years old. And people were fleeing Cuba then in 1960, and they're fleeing Cuba now. Not because he's a charming, iconic figure, but because he was a ruthless dictator. And he's had an opportunity to now allow his brother Raul to slide into power. But the question of human rights under Fidel or Raul are just as bleak. They imprison people for speaking their minds. There's no free press. There's no show like your show in Cuba. Everything is state-sponsored newspapers, state-sponsored media, and human rights dissidents are rounded up and thrown in jail. The very peaceful group called Las Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white, they dress in white, and they march peacefully to the Catholic Church every Sunday, and with holding up a photo of their loved ones who have been or are in jail for political reasons. And for that, they're beaten up and thrown in jail, sometimes for 2 days, sometimes for 1 hour, sometimes for weeks and months at a time. So human rights is still terrible.
It is terrible. You're painting such a stark picture, a bleak picture of exactly the reality of what's going on in Cuba to this day. And Ileana, I know this is a very personal story for you and for so many out there. We do want to thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's bring in now ABC News political contributor Alex Castellano from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Alex was born in Cuba, came to the U.S. shortly after Castro took power. We also want to include in this part of the discussion ABC's Tom Yamas, who's here with us in studio, has been speaking very powerfully about his family's experience. His parents fled Cuba many years ago, and you were raised among Cuban expats here in this country. Alex, let me start with you. You have a story, a very powerful story of being in school as a child under a newly empowered Fidel Castro. What was that like?
Well, that's one of the reasons my parents left Cuba, took us out of Cuba to the United States. I would, when Castro took over, I would bring home from school the color-in pictures of the brave Cuban soldier bayoneting the cowardly American soldier, brainwashing the kids. And one day at school, our teachers said, all right, kids, pray to God for ice cream. And we closed our eyes, no ice cream. And then the teacher says, well, let's ask Fidel for ice cream. And yay, we got ice cream. At first, the Castro regime tried to undermine the church before they decided it was easier to co-opt it. But that's the story of Fidel and Raul Castro in Cuba and 60 years of socialism and communism and failure.
Alex, you told us your parents got you out of Cuba in 1961. You left with $11 and 2 suitcases. Do you think, after this death overnight of Fidel Castro, that things will change on the ground in the country of your birth?
I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. Raul Castro basically has been in power since 2006, since 2008 officially, and Cuba is a military oligopoly. It's run by the military, the generals. Raul Castro is the head of the military, and all business in Cuba runs through a thing called Gaesa, which is a conglomerate owned by the military itself. And 60 to 80% of Cuban economic activity goes through this military-owned, basically, conglomerate. So I think if both Castros left, you would still see Cuba, very much like Egypt, controlled by the military.
And Tom, you were mentioning earlier during the commercial break, I know that this is somewhat of an emotional day for you, for so many Cuban Americans, but you said that you and your family have been waiting for this day. Now that it's here, how do you reconcile those emotions?
It's interesting. Almost every New Year's Eve, Cuban Americans' families say next year in Havana, or next year in Cuba. That's what you kind of celebrate. I think it's a time for reflection. It's a time to remember all of our relatives that came over, like my grandparents, who never got to see their country again, but who never fully unpacked their briefcases and their luggage because they thought there would be a day where they could go back. As far as Cuba changing, more than 75% of Cubans right now have known no leader other than Fidel Castro or Raul Castro. They don't know what democracy looks like. For any change to happen, it's going to happen with the Cuban people.
Probably should not expect overnight change. Tom Llamas, that image of your grandparents never fully unpacking is indelible. Thank you very much, both to Tom Llamas and Alex Castellano. And we are back now with more on the death of Fidel Castro.
And we are joined by Philip Brenner from Washington. He's a professor at American University and an expert on Latin America. Professor, thank you for joining us. We're already hearing so many different perspectives of Castro on this show, but how do you think he'll go down in history?
I think that's an important question because I think Americans are getting a wrong picture about Fidel Castro. The rest of the world is very saddened by this. He was probably the last of the great world leaders that this generation will know, and Americans should understand why that is.
Why is it, in your view? Because we've been hearing from people throughout the show this morning who say that he was a tyrant, violent, and led his people to sort of countless miseries.
Well, in fact, you heard something about the achievements in Cuba. The most important achievement probably was that he gave Cubans a sense of dignity. That was true for about 20% of Cubans before the revolution. There was no democracy that they ever experienced in Cuba. They had corrupt governments before that did very little for the majority of the people. The vast majority of Cubans benefited from the Cuban Revolution. And other countries around the world, poor countries, looked to Cuba in that way as a leader for what they could do for their people, bringing literacy and health care.
We've got just a few seconds left. Can you just quickly tell us what you think is going to happen now for people in Cuba after Fidel Castro has died?
Fidel Castro really has not been involved very much in anything day to day or even in the large policy directions for the last at least 5 years. So I don't think there will be much change. I've gotten messages from friends in Cuba who tell me that there is great sadness, as if the father of the country has died.
Philip Brenner, professor at American University, we appreciate your insight this morning. Thank you very much. And coming up here on GMA, we continue with our coverage of Fidel Castro's death.
And a look at the flood of tourists hitting Cuba. Could it change everything? Keep it right here.
And welcome back as we continue our coverage of the breaking news, the death of Fidel Castro at age 90.
And Cuba is opening its doors to more and more tourists these days, drawn by its history and a sense of nostalgia. One of those tourists was our own Ron Claiborne. You recently visited the country. What did you see?
Well, I'm actually on assignment, just for the record. But for a long time, the U.S. and Cuba have had a strained relationship. The economic embargo, which is still on, broken off diplomatic relations, refugee crises. But in the last year, that's begun to change, and dramatically. One of those changes, Americans can now travel to Cuba a lot more easily.
It began with last year's restoration of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. The U.S. Embassy in Havana opened shortly afterward. American tourism in Cuba forever transformed.
The progress that we mark today is yet another demonstration that we don't have to be imprisoned by the past. When something isn't working, we can and will change.
In May of this year, a Carnival cruise liner docked in Havana, the first American cruise ship to arrive in Cuba in decades. And in August, the first direct commercial flight traveling between the two countries since 1962. Americans now flooding the island and filling up hotels with record bookings. On my trip to Cuba this past May, I ran into several American tourists.
Now it's here. The Americans are here, the tourism is here.
An influx of visitors bringing much-needed income to Cuba's tourist industry. A big difference from my first visit 20 years ago.
I first came to Cuba 19 years ago, and at that time, this area, Old Havana, was pretty much in disrepair. I came back a second time, 2 years later, and this area was being restored. And now, 19 years after my first visit to Havana, Old Havana has been pretty much restored to its centuries-old splendor.
When President Obama visited Havana earlier this year, he was the first sitting president to visit Cuba since 1928. Major League Baseball holding a preseason game there last March, the first time since 1999. And that same month, rock legends the Rolling Stones strutting in front of a huge crowd, many of whom used to have to listen to their favorite rock bands behind closed doors.
It's brilliant. It's very historical thing.
That's a lot of change in 1 year for a country once frozen in time for more than half a century and mostly forgotten by American travelers until now.
And just one point that Americans cannot just get on a plane and go there. You need to go as part of a cultural tour. So the tourism, it's picking up, but it's not open. You didn't just fly there.
It almost looks like you're walking into a time capsule.
In many ways, yeah, absolutely.
All right, Rod, thank you so much. We'll be right back, everyone.
Our team coverage on the death of Fidel Castro at the age of 90.
Castro will be buried in the city of Santiago on Sunday, December 4th, after days of public mourning and a tour of his ashes throughout Cuba. He did express his will to be cremated.
Of course, we're going to keep you up to date all day long on all of these developments right here on ABC News and abcnews.com. We want to thank you for joining us. We'll see you right back here tomorrow morning.